All right, so tonight is Flexbox night, which is exciting for two reasons. One, Flexbox is amazing and will make everything that you did. Sorry, I get distracted. I'm not chewing gum. I just ate a protein bar before we started, and now I have like almonds in my teeth, and I was trying to get them out before we started, but you guys caught me, so darn. All right, back to Flexbox. So Flexbox night is exciting because Flexbox is really fun to use and will make everything way easier. And also it's exciting because it is your fourth night. So this is the last lesson before your first sprint challenge. So that is coming this weekend, and you're going to get a chance to put all the information you've gathered over these 2 weeks to the test. So let's go ahead and I'll open with a question. So what do you guys think was the hardest or most frustrating part of the last project, the one you worked on last night? Try and get the almonds out of my mouth while you answer. Everything, centering, columns, lining up, formatting, just generally positioning. Yeah, okay. So almost everything you've responded there. I'm not saying that this is completely a Hail Mary, but almost everything you've answered is about to get way easier. So we want to start thinking a little bit differently about CSS from tonight onward. Tonight is almost a preview into what we'll talk about next week. So let's think a little bit about the history of web pages and web applications. When it started out, we were thinking about desktop only, right? And next week, the next sprint, so the next 2 weeks are going to be all about responsive design. But the idea was that roughly speaking, everyone is looking at web pages on essentially the same size screen, the same size browser. So when you think about the way that you did your design last night, yeah, it was frustrating, but as long as you can hard code in pixels, it's not the end of the world. So this whole pixel model was really designed with the idea that things are going to more or less look all right no matter the device. Or it's not no matter the device, because there is one device, a computer. And then laptops get more popular, and then there are smartphones and tablets, and everything is crazy. So Flexbox is very much built on a much more modern understanding of what web pages are. So in some ways, Flexbox is more limiting. They will actually restrict the types of things you can do, but it will guarantee that it looks good. And so that's the way we want to start thinking about our web apps from here forward. It's a very rare thing that you'll need something that's pixel perfect, though it might come up. So what we want to think about now is it's not about being a control freak. It's not about having utter control over where exactly everything is, because there's no point in thinking that way anyways. It's going to have to work on a ton of different screen sizes and devices. It's about just guaranteeing that it's going to look good and be functional on a variety of devices. And that's what Flexbox is all about. So what is Flexbox? The shortest answer is it is a display property. We already saw some other display properties: display block, display inline, inline block. We explored display none briefly. Those are all properties. So Flex is literally just another option for display. But it's a bit more powerful than all the ones I just listed, because it's not just a property. It's actually a module, which means that by adding this to our code, we're going to unlock a bunch of CSS properties that are going to allow us to do all sorts of cool things. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start to explore what this looks like. All right. So let's take a look at, actually, this is really useful and we're going to use it a bunch. So let me paste it in here, just a resource, but let's actually start in CodePen. And I will also give you the link to the guided pen I'll be using tonight. All right, so we have some squares, some colorful squares. Let's take a look at what's going on in our code. We have these 4 boxes, they're all divs, and they're inside of a larger container. So, and then if we look at our code here, we see that there's a class called box that's on all 4 of these items. And then each has a unique class as well. So we have some basic styling. We don't really need that. We have some basic styling that gives them some height, width. Don't really need padding either. Let's kill that one. So we have some height and some width and some margin. And then we see that each of the 4 boxes also has a unique color that'll allow us to distinguish them. So that's all fine and good. Can anyone tell me, for these 4 boxes, what display property do they currently have? So what is the default? Because there's no, on them, there's no actual display property set. Block. Yep. How do you guys know? How did you know that? Because they're divs. Yep. So by default, divs are going to be block. We could also maybe infer it by the fact that I was able to add a height and a width. It doesn't for sure tell us that it is a block, but it's a hint. They start on separate lines. That's another really good hint. Between that and the height and width, we probably could have figured it out even if we didn't know that that was div's default. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this container. This is a little bit of a new one. So where is this container on my browser here? Where does this container div live? How much of the screen is it taking up? All around the blocks and the full width of the screen, exactly. So just to make sure we know where our container is, let's throw a border on it really quick. So you guys are correct that this is taking up the width of the screen minus the default. I haven't done a reset in here, so there's a little bit of that default margin. There's the margin from the boxes, but apart from that, we see this typical block behavior of it's taking up the width of the screen and the height of the content. So just to give us an idea of where the container is, I'm going to go ahead and kill this border. Well, let's leave it on. It's always nice to see what we're doing. All right, so what we have here is the perfect setup for display flex. So given what we know at this point, given what we learned on Monday, if we wanted these boxes to all be next to each other in a row, how could we accomplish that? Make them inline block. So we could do that really quick. Display inline block. Notice I'm putting this on the box selector. So this is actually going on each of these 4 divs, this display inline block. So automatically, they're all nice and next to each other. Now, that was pretty easy. That was just 1 line of code. But what if I wanted them to be moved all the way over to the right? Instead of being aligned to the left, what could I do if I wanted them to be aligned to the right? Anyone know? So text align wouldn't work because that only works for actual text instead of element. There's a margin left. I could use vertical align. I could start to add padding. There's a few different ways. What if I wanted them to be kind of spaced out nice and evenly throughout here? And once again, we're not talking about flex yet. We're just talking about what we already learned on Monday. So no grid, no flex. Yeah, we could add some margin and padding. We could try to get the margin and padding and the width to add up to 24% more or less, do some math. So there are certainly ways to get these to behave, but they all kind of require some brain racking. So what flex is going to do for us is allow us to move the groups of elements around, position them, change the alignment, change the spacing in a really easy, intuitive way. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. This is the old way of doing things. So the model for flex is whenever we have a group of elements inside a container. So there always should be one level of nesting when we're going to use flex. So if we didn't have this container, if we just had 4 boxes, we wouldn't really be able to use flex. So once again, the starting point for flex should always be some sort of HTML element that contains some children elements. So while we put the display inline directly on the elements, this is the first thing that makes flex a little different, is what we're actually going to do is put it on the parent. So we'll put on the parent display flex. So I'm going to say this a few more times because this is a critical idea to get drilled in your head, which is that we use display flex on the container when we want to change the behavior of the children. Changes behavior of children. So display flex, the very first thing we know about it is that when we put it on an element, it's going to affect the behavior of all the elements nested inside of it. So we saw from the get-go that this automatically did what we saw before. So can anyone infer behind the scenes, what do you think is happening? This is a little weird, right? We're used to properties affecting the element they're actually on, not the children. But what do you think that adding display flex did behind the scenes to all of these 4 children inside of this element? It made them inline block, exactly. So these are actually inline block elements now. We never put that code on ourselves, but this bit of code did that for us. So that is the first thing it did. The other thing it did is it just made a bunch of cool stuff available to us. So I'll give you just a quick little demo here, and then we'll start to talk about some terminology we need. So remember the questions I was asking of how do we change them so they're right aligned? We can now do just by changing this one property. Look how easily I'm able to move these boxes around. So this is kind of like magic if you've never seen it before. So this justify content property, which we'll talk a lot about tonight, along with a handful of others, is part of the Flex package. So what that means is that this property only is available on an element that has display flex. So if I comment this out, and like I did before, made these inline block, notice this doesn't do anything. Justify content literally has no effect. So this new idea we're working with here is that display flex actually is a module. It's going to make brand new properties available to us that weren't available before. Sweet. So we have to talk about a little bit of terminology here. So I'm going to define the 2 axes in display flex. Make sure you guys have this terminology down, and then we get to unpack some of these cool new properties we have available. So now I will jump on in here. So let's go to, well, actually the first thing we need to know is containers and items. Remember, flex only works when we have an element with other elements nested in. So the 2 terms we need to start is we'll talk about the container, which is the parent, and the items, which are the children. So let's talk about, so we see flex container, flex item here. So let's talk about the 2 axes. So we're going to be exploring this idea of there being a main axis and a cross axis. The key way of telling them apart is that the main axis goes through all flex items, whereas the cross axis intersects that, it's perpendicular. So back over here, which one is the main axis? Remember, our definition of main axis is it cuts all the items in half. It's the width, so it's going to be from left to right. Whereas if we had something that looked like this, what would be the main axis now? Vertical. Yep. So don't get caught up on thinking, oh, the main axis is always horizontal. It depends on how our items are positioned. So think of the main axis as cutting all of them. So it's like, think of it as the shish kebab skewer going through all of our flex items. And then back to this example, what would be our cross axis? Cross axis would be top to bottom, vertical. Yep. So the cross axis just crosses maybe one of the items, whereas the main axis is the skewer that goes through. So we will need to have those terms down pretty cold so we can start to, because things can get, one of the powerful things about this is that our access can shift. But if we don't have those terms down, it can start to get a little confusing. So those are the two critical terms we need to know. And now that we know those, we also need to understand where we have something called a start and an end. There's a main start, a main end, a cross start, and a cross end. So we can think of these axes as not only being a line, but actually being a ray, like an arrow that has a direction. But we'll talk more about that in just a second. Let's start to unpack our first property. So I already demoed this property for you, justify content, but this is what allows us to move items around on the main axis. So we can think about shifting the positioning across the main axis. So you guys already saw that we had, or I didn't actually show you start. The default is start. And then we have end. Oops, sorry, flex end. Sorry, the default is flex start. Start is not a real thing. We have a flex end. We have a center. And then we have three different ways of distributing things. So we have space evenly. That means that there's even space between all items, including on the ends. We have space around. That means that there's even space on each side. So notice that on each side, there's kind of a half amount of space. That's the difference between space around and space evenly. Those two can get confusing. And then space between, which means there's no space on each end, but equal space between all items. So this goes back to this idea of we don't have full control of exactly where they go, but we've just been given these 6 options that all are gonna look pretty good no matter what. So yay. All right, so the last thing I wanna show you before I open things up to questions is that, like I said, we do have to think about these axes as having a start and an end. So when I set this to flex start, that means go to the start of my main axis. So we can tell by default, the start of the main axis is going to be on the left, assuming they're positioned this way. So our default is that our start is on the left, our end is on the right. But once again, don't get too attached to that idea of the start being in a fixed place, because we're going to see that it can start to move around. All right, let me pause for a minute here. I'll answer any questions in Slido, and then we'll take a look at one of these other properties that's now available to us. Okay, question about the sprint challenge. I will save this question for maybe right before break so we can stay focused. Can we specify the amount of space? No, we can't. So that's kind of the idea, is that, like I said, we don't have full control. It's more about just, it's gonna look nice and even and symmetrical. So we do not have the control to actually specify exact things like that. One thing I'll mention on that note is that there is also something in CSS called CSS Grid that works similar to Flex, but it's more complex. So it still doesn't necessarily give you full control, but if you want to work with something similar to Flex, but that gives you a bit more flexibility and control, if you have a website design that requires a bit of a finer touch, CSS Grid works well for that. The reason we teach Flexbox instead of CSS Grid is that Flexbox is going to be great in most cases. So it's a lower learning curve. It's going to be great in most cases. And once you have Flexbox mastered, if you move on to CSS Grid, it'll make more sense. All right, so Flex properties are just auto-writing basic CSS for us. Essentially, yeah. So, I mean, they are CSS, but yeah, they're taking care of math for us. You know, that those annoying math problems I gave you on Monday, they are doing the math for us. So what they're doing behind the scenes is calculating how wide the parent container is, and then setting up margins and padding based on that, so we don't have to. All right, are people having lag issues? All right, cool. All right, when I do display flex, okay, so this sounds like what you're talking about is actually not a flex thing. So if you want to change the alignment of text, like if you want to center your text or justify it or move it to the right or left, that's going to be a text align issue, not a flex issue. And in fact, on an example we're going to do at the end tonight, we actually have some justified text. But once again, that's just text align. You really wouldn't use flex to change the alignment of your text because text isn't really an element. It's actually just contents of an element. An element can be a flex container and item at the same time. Yes, actually it can be. So this brings up an important point. Let me jump back over into here. So inside of box one, let's add a couple other things. So let's do and this was me trying to get clever with like grandchild and box, but I don't think this makes sense. So we'll just make this grandchild 1 and grandchild 2. Okay, so give me just a second to set this up. So let's also give these both grandchild properties. All right, so I've put 2 divs inside of box 1. So what I'm going to do is grab both of these grandchildren, give them just a tiny little height and width. And let's give them this pink color. That'll show up nicely in there. Okay. And a tiny bit of margin. Okay, so we have 2 itty baby boxes inside of this. So we know that this outer container, the white one with the border, is a flex container. And we know that these 4 boxes are flex items. But there's nothing stopping a flex item from also being a flex container. So the first thing I want to highlight is that flex only goes 1 layer deep. So all the properties we have on container do not affect these two grandchildren. And that's because it doesn't trickle down. So they're just going to affect the immediate children. But if we wanted to make these flex items, how could we do that? Does anyone know if we wanted to make these flex items, how could we do that? Any thoughts? We do have to add display flex, but on what item? On box 1. So we always add display flex on the parent. So now if we go in here and do display flex, check that out. And we could do something like justify content center and start to do that as well. So yep, because these are the immediate children of box 1, we can do that as well. So you'll see this frequently where an item is both, or an element is both a flex item of a bigger container and also a container of some of its own items. And yeah, notice if we take flex off the parent, that doesn't affect what's going on in here in any way. All right, so let's go back here. Do we have to specify the total width of the container? We don't have to, but we can. So in this case, we have not specified the width of the container, but we're free to. So what will happen if we wanted our bigger container to say, have a width of 70%? Let's actually, this will be cooler. So let's do space around. So notice that as I adjust the size of the parent, the children just automatically adjust. So Flex already knows the size of the parent. All right, let's move forward. So we, let's go down here. All right, so we're going in a slightly different order than they did. So we already talked about justify content. As a reminder, these are the 6 options. We can push everything to the start, push everything to the end, put it in the center, space between, which leaves no space on the side but evenly distributes them, space around, where essentially there's even space but then little half spaces on each side, and then space evenly, which is true even spaces. So these last 3 are easy to get mixed up. It'll just take a little practice, and this diagram is really useful for remembering which is which. So I wanted to show you this one because I think this one's fun and exciting, but let's kind of scroll back to basics and talk about our flex direction. As mentioned, there's always a direction that's going across the main axis. So the default direction is going to be row. The row direction means that everything is aligned, that the main axis is going across horizontally, starting from the left, going to the right. So flex direction default is row. Now there's also column. So if we want to flip these things down to a column, that's an option, and we just have to change this. All right, so reminder of terminology. Where is my main axis? Now that I've changed my flex direction to column, where is my main axis? It's now vertical. And where is my flex start? At the top. So we can think of the main axis as going from top to bottom, skewering down. All right, let me show you one called row reverse. Where is my main axis now? And what direction is it going? It is horizontal, but this time it's going right to left. So if I change justify content to flex start, where do you think these boxes are going to go? To the right. Awesome. Yeah, this is where it gets a little, you have to keep track of a few things. So the flex start, like I said, it's not necessarily on the left. It depends on our flex direction. So flex direction can change both the main axis and the cross axis. So can change both the axes and the flex start. So that's what this has the power to do. So we have 4 options. Row, row reverse, column, and column reverse. We haven't seen column reverse yet, but I bet you guys can guess what that one does. Where do you think my flex start is going to go when I change column reverse, or change this to column reverse? To the bottom. So we can see that this box 1 is now at the bottom. Nice. All right, we'll put this back to row. All right, so this is good. I think I've kind of drilled in these main terms, and that'll help us keep track of what we're doing with all these different properties. All right, so I want to give you guys a chance to practice this, and congratulations, you guys get to be guinea pigs tonight. So I don't normally use breakout rooms in my lessons, but I did use them in launch, and they can be pretty fun. So we're going to try out some breakout room activities tonight. So just a couple things about breakout rooms. They'll work a little bit differently than when I give you just a you do assignment, because I want you to work as a group. So I'll put you in rooms. You should be working as a group. So here are the guidelines. 1 is you should not be silently working on this on your own. That is not the point of this. You should pick someone to drive, so they'll share their screen. They'll actually be the one typing, but everyone should be discussing this. On that note, guideline 2 is the idea is that the person who understands this the most shouldn't be the one zipping through this while everyone is left in the dust. If you feel more confident on this than some of your teammates, try to match their speed. Try to help bring them to your level. This is about, and keep in mind, you're not just doing them a favor. You're practicing your communication skills. You're building these real skills that you are going to need, first of all, to graduate Lambda school, but also in the job. And on that note, we will have TLs as well as myself in the rooms. So if you are not following these guidelines, we'll be watching you. So I have an assignment for you. I'll be posting this in CodePen in just a moment, and you will have 8 minutes to work on this. So let me put you guys in breakout rooms. We'll start the clock, and then you can get going on it. Any quick questions about how these breakout rooms are going to work before we actually break you up? Oh, and to answer this, the grandchildren will maintain their access unless we change it on their container. So nothing can trickle down to grandchildren. We'd have to actually go in to box 1 and change this. So we could go into box 1 and say flex direction column, and that would affect the grandchildren. All right, cool. So let's do breakout rooms. Exactly. So someone should, I've just sent out that CodePen, someone should share their screen and have that open, and they're the ones typing, but everyone should be discussing. And in fact, the person who's typing, the burden is on you not to get ahead, not to do stuff just because it pops into your head, to actually listen to what other people say and follow their lead. All right, so let's do some breakout rooms. Give me 1 second. Also, since I am kind of piloting this, please give your TLs feedback on if you thought this was helpful or a waste of time, because that will impact whether we continue to do breakout rooms or not. Hold on. Sorry, 1 sec. All right, let's do it.
Can you make me a co-host as well?
Sorry, who said that?
Matt.
Hey, Diandra, could you make me a co-host as well?
Sorry, who's talking?
Alex.
Alex.
Miller.
It says you are already a co-host.
Oh, am I? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, I think people are mostly trickled back in. Let's go ahead and go over the solution to that. Actually, sorry, give me 1 second. There we go. All right, so the trick here, the first thing to know is that whenever we want to add flex, we have to always target the parent. So challenge 1 refers to this cluster of boxes. So we can't target any of the individual boxes. We have to actually target the container. So we can use this class selector of challenge 1. Next step is always to add display flex. And then we want to, and then it says make all the boxes line up beside each other. We're good to go because by default, it's putting them in a row. So the next one is make all the boxes line up beside each other in reverse direction. So there's going to be this pattern of we always select the container for each challenge. We always do display flex. In this one, we want not just a row, but a row in reverse. So we can use flex direction to do row reverse. As a reminder, flex direction only works if we have display flex. So we have to type display flex every time so that these properties become available. On challenge 3, we want all the boxes to go in a column in reverse direction. So it's going to be very similar. We select the challenge 3 container, and we can just confirm that this does actually match the class names in all this code. Display flex, and then flex direction. We want a column, but we want a column in reverse. So we see that the red one is actually at the top. So our flex start is at the bottom here. For challenge 4, we want to make all of the boxes go in a row with equal space around them. So we can grab our challenge 4 container. That's this one. Display flex, and then now we don't actually care about flex direction because they're already in a row, but we do care about justify content. And we can do space around on them. Right, and then challenge 5 is they're all in a row with equal space between them. So challenge 5, we'll do display flex. And once again, we don't need to set a flex direction because they're already in a row, but we do need to use justify content for space between. And this is a nice way to visualize the difference between space around and space between. Okay, any questions about this challenge? Sweet. Just as a little terminology review here, now that you've had a chance to practice. So we know that our main axis skewers through the items. And we also know that our start, though by default over on the left, can move around depending on if we're in a row, in a column, if we're reversed or not. All right, I'm going to give you guys one more chance to practice this time just on your own. And in this case, you'll actually be practicing on more of a real world example. So using what you have learned, your job is to create a nav bar with at least 3 links and make the items on the nav bar centered horizontally. So this one you'll do on your own. I'm only going to give you, let's say, 3 minutes to work on it. And then after we're done with this, we'll take our break. So work on this one on your own. All right, let's wrap up that second challenge. So this is tying what we've learned into the stuff we've already been working on. So we know how to create a nav bar. We create a nav element and then some anchors. And we should already see that this is a prime opportunity to use flex. I'll add one more. So why is a nav bar kind of a prime opportunity to use flex? What about the structure of the HTML should clue us that maybe flex might be useful here? Yep, there's a container and children elements. So we have this container with a bunch of children in it. So on that note, remember for all these properties we've learned so far, we always want to target the container. So we will be adding styling to the nav, not the anchors themselves. So on our nav, let me just give it a little bit of margin because that'll make life look better. I'm going to give it some top and bottom margin. So not flex related, but just make it look a little better. And then we can do display flex. Okay, so by default, everything is still in a row. So because anchors are not block element, we didn't see this kind of dramatic column to row shift happen, but we can see that they got kind of scrunched together. So we wanted 3 links, and it says make the items on the nav bar centered horizontally. So we can use justify content center to do that. And though I didn't specify this, I hope you guys noticed that that looks pretty bad. So one extra thing you might have done just to make things a little nicer is maybe added a little bit of padding to these anchors. I'll kind of reverse what I did on the margin, do 0 for top and bottom, and then let's just do maybe 10%. Oh, that's pretty big. Let's just do like 3% left and right padding. So we can still use padding to, if we want things that are centered, but kind of with this distribution, we can still use some of our old tricks. So like this 6%, 7%, it's oriented towards the center, but a little more distributed. So we still do have some flexibility with things like that. All right, I'm going to answer any last questions on what we've seen so far, and then we'll take our break. So challenge 4, be spaced evenly. I may have misspoken on that one. Let me double check. Okay, so this is where semantics get confusing. My assumption is that this means space around because it literally said space around. So the reason that this would be called equal space around is because you could think of it this way. Imagine there's a line right here. So where my mouse is, there's a line directly in between the green and the yellow. So notice there's equal space on the left and right of the green one. There's equal space on the left and right of the yellow one. There's equal space. So that's why it's called space around. And if you misinterpreted this and used a different justify content property, that's fine. That's not the end of the world. It's more about understanding how to put these things on. All right. The link to the diagram I'm referencing, I will repost this link. To see this diagram, just make sure you click basics and terminology. Really good diagram. Could we have used margin instead of padding? Yep, that's totally fine. In this case, they would have behaved exactly the same. The important part was the flex, but adding a little margin and padding to make it pretty is always nice. And I will answer this question now. For the sprint challenge, can we start when we're ready? Nope, you should need to do it in the exact time slot allotted for you. And yes, that CSS tricks link is in training kit if you ever need to find it. All right, let's take 5 minutes. There's a couple more flex properties I want to show you after break. And then at the end, we'll practice applying this to a actual website. So I'll see you guys in 5. All right, let's wrap up that break. So while you guys were breaking, some changes were made to our guided project. So let me just update you. I just commented out these grandchildren just because they were annoying me. But mostly what I did is I actually added a couple boxes. So notice now we have 6 boxes in here. Also notice that they got a little bigger. So we have 6 boxes, they're a little bigger, and then I just went ahead and commented out display flex. So right now there's no flex box on these. All right, so when I comment back in display flex, we hope to see these appear in a row, but there's a slight problem. Now that I've added a few more and made them bigger, what problem might we have when I try to add display flex on this? They won't fit. So what do you think is going to happen? So some people are suggesting maybe they're going to start to wrap around, start to appear on a new line. Some people think they might start to overlap. Some people think they might shrink. All good options. They might be cut off. So we would hope that it wouldn't be that they'd overlap or be cut off, because the whole idea is flex wants to make things look good at all costs. So I'm thinking that the 2 good options you guys have thrown out are that they're either going to wrap or they're going to start to shrink. Both of those are nice intuitive ways to preserve the general structure. So let's comment this back in and see what it does. So they actually start to shrink. So we can see that they are no longer square shaped. And if we tweak the width of this container a little more, at some point it's going to look pretty bad, but they do shrink. So the default behavior when you have items that might overflow your container is that they'll actually start to shrink. The idea, once again, being that Flex's main goal is to make it look good at all costs. But if we wanted them to wrap instead, that would be an option. So down here in our, we see that there's a property called flex wrap. So our default is no wrap. The default is that instead of wrapping, they'll start to shrink. But if we want, we can change this property to wrap. So let's see how that looks. So we can go in and do flex wrap, wrap, not warp. So now we preserve the size and we see they start to wrap. And if we change this to say space around, they'll wrap and it'll still space around. So there is one other option, wrap reverse. So what they do is they actually, this is a little confusing. Wrap reverse, you probably will not have to use this, but notice that this is, actually, let me just throw so we can see what's going on here. And 1 second, let me make the color on these white. So they're actually still going. The flex start has not changed, but they're starting at the bottom row and wrapping to the top. So that's kind of weird, just so you know how that works. But mostly at this point, as long as you know about wrap and no wrap, you're good to go. So let me take these numbers off because they're ugly. And for the most part, I think it's pretty easy to see what order we're in. All right, so that's flex wrap. Pretty straightforward. It's just about if we have an overflow, are they going to wrap or are they going to shrink? So the last property I want to introduce you to tonight is called align items. And let me actually, let's kill these. So goodbye, other 2 boxes. And then I'm going to do one other thing before I introduce you to align items. So I want to actually make my container a little bit bigger. So I'm going to add a height to this container of 80 VH. If you guys have not seen VH so far, this stands for view height, and it just means 80% of the browser height. So we can't really use percentage very easily for height unless we're already in something with a height. But this is a nice default for setting the height for big sections or headers or footers. So 80 view height. All right. So now that I have, and that is not anything Flex related. That is just regular old CSS. We can use that whenever. Okay, so we know that justify content is all about moving things around on the main axis, but we haven't talked too much about our friend, the cross axis. So the cross axis is always perpendicular to our main axis. We could think of it as it only spears one of the items, or maybe even depending on where you imagine it, it goes in between the items potentially. So what would happen, or how could we go about centering something on the main axis? If we wanted these boxes fully centered in the screen, we know that justify content center will center them one way, but we don't have a way of centering them the other way. And the first thing I want to say is that you cannot use justify content to move things along the cross axis. The whole point is that justify content is for the main axis. But there does exist a property that does something very similar for the cross axis, and that is align items. So let's go to our diagram. Line items. Yep, so this is all about the cross axis. So we can see that we can stretch items, we can move them to the start, the end, the center. We can do something called baseline, which actually centers, or it aligns the content rather than the containers themselves. So let's play with this a little bit. Interesting. Let's do center. That was our goal. Sweet. So centering things in the middle of a container, so easy with Flex. All we need is display Flex, justify content, and align items both centered. So now they have moved across the main axis. All right, if we do align items Flex start, this is going to jump them to the top. If we do Flex end, jump to the bottom. So here's where it gets confusing. What is going to happen if I change Flex direction to column? Where are these items going to go? Can anyone describe what my boxes will do if I change Flex direction to column? They'll move to the right side. Can you say anything else? They'll be stacked vertically on the right. All right, let's try it out. Well, actually, that was correct, but we don't have quite enough room for them. Sorry, let's make them a little smaller. There we go. So yes, you're correct. They are stacked vertically on the right and they are centered. So let's break down what just happened here. So if you ever are disoriented in FlexLand, first question is, where is our main axis? Actually, this might be a good, I never have used, tonight is like I'm branching out in Zoom. I might try and use the draw on the annotate feature. So where is our main axis? That's the first thing we want to know. Top to bottom. Yep. So our Flex start is going to be, did someone else draw that or am I just crazy? All right, whoever drew it, make it go away because I want to draw it myself. All right, well, I guess I'll run with it. Okay, there it is. So yeah, our main axis, that's an M, starts at the top and goes down. That's determined by flex direction column. So that will always be true. Will always be our main axis when flex direction is column. And then our cross axis is going to be like this. So this is our cross axis. I'm not going to draw it all the way. So we know that when we change flex direction to column, the cross axis is always perpendicular. And so it's going from left to right. So justify content center, remember justify content is all about the main axis. So that means that along this, these guys are centered. So with respect to, let me get rid of annotate for a second. With respect to our main axis, these are in the center. So that's why they're centered from top to bottom. With respect to our cross axis, they're at the end. So what happens if I change align items to flex start? What will happen to my boxes if I change this to flex start? They'll go all the way to the left, yep. So they're moving along the cross axis. As we go from start to center to end, we can see them moving along the cross axis. Same thing, but reverse for justify content. If we make this flex start, see they go up to the start of our main axis. If we make this flex end, they go to the bottom. So once we have justify content and align items in play, it can be a little bit of cognitive gymnastics to keep track of which axis is which, where's our start, where's our end, which one's doing which. But if you just, and it's totally normal to get a little confused, but just pause, look at the diagram if you need to, draw it out if you need to, and it should start to become second nature as you get used to it. All right, so that is all of the flex properties I wanted to introduce you to. I do want to just mention real quick that there are others. So for, oh wait, let me get rid of this annotation. Let's clear. Cool. So we see that, for example, there's a flex flow, which allows us to do direction and wrap together. There's also a handful of these properties that are just for children. So notice everything we've done so far goes on the container, not the items. But we can start to do interesting things with ordering items, sizing items, and even moving one item independent of other ones. So these are all options of things we can do with flex, but they're a little more obscure cases, a little more advanced, so we won't cover them tonight, but they are there. All right, so, and then, and there's one more. Yeah, and there is also an align content, which has to do, this only applies if you have multiple rows. So this is about aligning things with respect to rows. So this can become useful when you have something that's flex wrapping. But once again, if you want to use it, I'll let you just look at the docs. So we have one more breakout room challenge for you to practice this, but let me just check and see if there are any questions in Slido before I split you guys up again. Can we follow the technique in orientation and take 5-minute breaks closer to 20-minute intervals? No, because we wouldn't have enough time to cover all the material, though that would be nice if we could. How would you go about perfectly centering content within the boxes? Good question. So let's say we had some content in our boxes. I'll give them, once again, some ugly numbers. So how would we go about centering the content? The answer depends on if the content is text or another HTML element. So if we wanted to center text in the boxes, let me see. Let me just really quickly get rid of. There we go. All right, so if we wanted to center text, flex doesn't come into play. So we could always do text align. So text align is not anything flex related. It's just for text. So we could do text align center. And then we could do, I'm trying to remember how to, I can't remember offhand if there's an easy way to perfectly center text by default, but we could always play with Matt. Will vertical align work with text? I can't remember. Let's try it. Yeah, as suspected, that only works for elements. So we could always just mess with margins and padding, but it's a little hacky. Yeah, there might be a way with line height. Anyways, so if you're wanting to center text, you could probably do a Google search. There might be a standard way of doing this. I can't recall. But once again, we can't use, so if we made these boxes flex containers, that still wouldn't work for text. Because remember, text is not an HTML element. So when we're just working with text, the answer is a little different. However, if we're talking instead about an element within an element, then that's a whole different story. So if we wanted to center an HTML element in here, then we would use flex. So we could go in and do, I'm just going to target box 1, display flex, and then what 2 properties would we want? How is that? How do we do it? No, vertical line still not working. Okay, sorry, doing 2 things at once. Let's go back here. So what 2 properties would we want to put on box 1 to get that pink box right in the middle? Justify content center and align items center. And now it's exactly in the middle. So no matter what size we make that grandchild, so let's say we want to make it a little smaller, it's still exactly in the middle, no matter what we do. Boxception, exactly. Oh, interesting suggestion of how to deal with the text issue. So let's try this out. If we do span and then some text, let's try that out. So we're going to grab box 2. Nicely done. Cool, really good solution here. So we just wrapped this text in a span, and that allowed us to use flex to center it. Great idea. Does align items baseline act the same as center if there is no content? I haven't worked with baseline much, so let's try it out. So let's go ahead and we're going to have to mess with these a little bit to set up this scenario. So let me put these back in a row. Let's do baseline. Cool, so it looks like because these 2 had content, it's lining up the content with the bottom. So if neither of them had content, so if we commented that out and commented that out, let's do flex start. So it looks like it's just doing flex start. So baseline works like flex start if there's no content. But we can see, oops, that if we put our content back, There's a nice little example of this thing working. So these guys are lined up with the bottoms of the other. Why is there no vertical alignment, but there is text align center? I think it's because so text align really works the way you would think of alignment in a word processor. So it's all about, because text is always going to be read from left to right, it's all about its positioning along that horizontal axis. So when you go into Microsoft Word or whatever text editor you're using, there's no way to center your text in the middle of your document. So it's really thinking about formatting text, which is kind of a one axis deal. What is span? So span is okay, so let's first remind ourselves what div is. So div is a catch-all block element. So when I say it's a catch-all element, it means there's no semantics. It's kind of if we don't know what else to use, we use a div. There's no meaning behind it. And when I say a block level element, that literally means it has a default of display block. It also means that we would use it as a container for grouping stuff together. So span is kind of like a div's cousin. It is also a catch-all element. It doesn't have any meaning. It's just if we use it when we don't know what else to use. The difference is that span by default is inline. So it's really good for something like this. And let me actually just put a little border around my span. So span is by default inline, so it's always going to wrap itself immediately around the content it contains. So it's good for if you need to, for example, style a couple words or phrases in a paragraph slightly differently. Spans are great for that kind of thing. So it was just a nice little catch-all element we could use to put this thing inside of something. And it allowed us, because we're allowed to position the span with flex, it allowed us to move our text around. Can we use the flex item to move it? I'm not sure what it is in this. So if you want to re-ask this and clarify what the it is, I will answer. It would work with a div as well. Once again, it's not that good. When you're writing these questions in Slido, I'm not necessarily going to see them the second that you post them. So make sure that you're clarifying what it is or they is, so I know what you're talking about. If we are, I still don't have context, so please try and write out an actual sentence. Do you mean if we used a div instead of a span to try and center the text? I'm going to assume that's what you mean, and it actually wouldn't work quite as well with the div, because a div, if we look at what a div would do here, so I'm going to call this text wrap. And let's do text wrap so we can see it. Interesting. Actually, that did work. I'm surprised. Oh, I think I know why. So let me do something real quick. Yes. Okay. Just kidding. Yep. You're right. It would work with a div, because I was thinking for a second that we'd have an issue with it taking up the space, but because of what Flex is doing behind the scenes, yes, it did work with the div instead. I think a span might be, I'm actually not going to say that. So span or div, either one works. Oh, do I have text line center? Let's see. Now I can't even remember all the properties I've put on everything. No, even without that, it still works. So apparently what Flex is doing is essentially, because that div became a Flex item, it's acting more like a span. So if we, this is, I don't want to go too far down this hole because this is kind of a weird edge case. If we took this off of, we can see that the div and the span are, so this is the difference between a div and a span generally. No, it's just acting super weird now. What in the world is going on here? Ah, CodePen got confused. Okay. So if we change this to a span, we see how it's going from inline to block. Wait, div, block, span, inline, yeah. So in a regular world, we can see how those two elements are behaving differently. However, apparently what happens is when we add display flex to this box, that div starts acting a lot more like a span. Yeah, if you have like a quick comment in response to something I said, maybe Slack would be a better place for that, but even so, it's just better that things in Slido are actually typed up. All right, if we available wrap the, okay, yeah, I will. If we are able to wrap on a parent element, will the parent element resize depending on his children element size if they are bigger than the parent? Okay, let me read that again. If we wrap on a parent element, will the parent element resize depending on the children's if they are bigger than the parent? So I don't think that the parent will ever resize. So let me give you maybe the most extreme example of this, which would be if the children were actually, one child was bigger than the parent. So, well, let's play with this a little. I'm going to start with, let's bring our other boxes back. Let's make this smaller. So we do have a case here. I'm going to get rid of this baseline, which is a little weird. So we do have a case here where we have started to break flex. You see these elements are starting to creep outside of their container. So flex does have its limitations. We can't, if our math is bad enough, it will start to look a little funky. So now let's go ahead, let's add flex wrap, it's on. And then let's go ahead and make our boxes a little bigger. Yeah, so the parent container will not get larger, but what will start to happen if we go crazy enough is that the children will creep outside of the boundaries. So the goal is that this will not happen, but at some point, if things don't quite add up, it might. So we have a very fixed, and keep in mind, this is only happening because I have set the height here. So I think in a previous class, this question of max width, min height, things like that came up. This might be an example where you'd use something like that if you want things to be able to stretch. So if it can stretch, that's one story. If we haven't actually explicitly limited the height, now things will start to stretch out. But if we get big enough, yeah, actually it looks like in this case, so we really only encounter serious problems when we have constrained our height. That for the most part, Flex is really good about making sure the children don't creep outside of the parent container, but if we've constrained the height of the container, we might start to have some problems. All right. Let me give you guys a chance to do, well, all right. You guys have done one breakout room. I'll let you vote. There's one more challenge. Would you rather do it as a breakout room or individually? I'm going to post a poll. Or, yeah, so don't answer. Don't flood Slack. I'm going to post a poll in a second. All right, just put that out there. All right, individual is like knockout winning. So I'm just gonna assume that will be the winner. All right, so here is our last bit of Flexbox practice. So I'm gonna give you 5 minutes on this one. It's a little more confusing what's going on in the HTML, so spend some time on it. You might not get through all of this one. It's a little more challenging. We'll work on this for 5 minutes and then we'll come back together. All right, let's wrap up that challenge and I'll show you guys the solution. So in this case, we have a little bit more of a complicated HTML structure. So we have this H2, we have a div class, and then this thing contains divs that contain paragraphs. So there's a lot more nesting going on, but if we still think about it, we have these divs that contain other divs. Doesn't matter that there's paragraphs within them, doesn't matter that there's headers above them. It's still that general parent, children. So we can use flex on all of these. So the first challenge is to make a 2-column grid. So we want to target challenge 1. That's going to be this darker div here, and do display flex. Wait. In this one, it's challenge 1. There we go. And notice that that already worked. So we might also want to add some margin or padding on these, but we're not going to worry about that. Or, yeah, actually, maybe we will. So let's do, just for fun, challenge 1. So divs inside of challenge 1, let's give those padding of left and right padding of 2%. That's nice. That looks better. All right, challenge 2, make a 4-column grid. So if you didn't do padding, that's totally fine. This is the more important part. Make a 4-column grid with equal space in between columns. So we can go ahead and do challenge 2, display flex. So that already created a 4-column grid. So this one's a little weird because we could do space between, might be some code that accidentally got deleting from this, so apologies. Let's go ahead and do challenge 2 divs and give them a width of 18%. So at this point, we can see that there is not equal space in between them. I'll just do 20. Not equal width between them. So in order to do that, we could do justify content because we're along our main axis, space between. All right, make 2 4-column grids inside of a 2-column grid. So to understand what's happening here, we really have to look at the code for challenge 3. So we can see that there's actually a grandchild thing going on here. So the first thing we want to do is target the bigger div here. So challenge 3 and do display flex. So these 2 upper divs, these 2 children have been turned into flex items. But if we want to create some flex items within our flex items, we have to now target their children. So we can do challenge 3 div, or we could just do 3 child. So everything's pretty scrunched, but once again, we have 2 flex boxes, or we have a flex box containing 2 items, and then each of those flex items is also a flex box containing 4 items apiece. Then finally, make a 4-column grid with unequal column widths. So what we could do here is grab challenge 4, display flex, and then if we want these guys to actually be different widths, we're going to have to go in and select them. So let's grab for child 1. And we can give it a width of, let's say, 10%. And whatever numbers you chose to use, they aren't going to be the same as mine. And then we will do with, I actually edited the code up here because I wanted to make it consistent. We could make this one maybe 5, that's going to be too small, 5%. Let's do 20. And for child 3, we can make a width of 13%. And maybe for child 4, we could, and this isn't anything flex, I'm just kind of making up numbers. We could do 24%. And then if we want to, we could mess with things like, it doesn't specify, you don't have to, but we could do something like space between or space evenly. So the big takeaway here is that all this flex stuff. This flex stuff is just review. But as you probably noticed, it gets more challenging when we're working with these complex HTML structures. So on that note, we are going to spend the last 10 minutes of class or so working through an example of building a web page using Flex. So here is our design mock-up. Let me zoom in a little more. So it's this page with just a couple sections here. So in the interest of time, we're not going to actually mark anything up here, though that's always the first step. But can you guys see any flex boxes hiding anywhere on this mock-up? Any flex boxes waiting to happen? The nav bar. So there isn't actually a footer on this, but all right, so someone said the about section. This one is, you could go either way. So there's no multiple children here. So you could center this just using padding and margin, or you could center it using flex. Either way works in something like this. The skills section, definitely some flex items here. And then this guy, this nice evenly centered thing, that seems like a flex box. There's one more that you guys didn't mention, but let's jump on into the code and we'll work on it. So I'm going to post one more pen for you guys. Let me save that. The last one is not the whole container. It is actually the whole nav header here. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually have the picture as one flex item and the nav bar as another one. So this will be more flexception. So we'll have a flex box here containing 2 items, and then the second item will itself be a flex box. So let's take a look here. We have this gigantic picture. We have some nav links, this, an about section. So a lot of it's already done for us, but we've got some work to do, clearly. So let's start by taking a look at this nav. So we have something called the upper nav inside of a header. And notice that this contains a logo and so this nav contains a logo and a div containing links. So this is going to be our first flex box here. We want this nav and to make these 2 guys flex items. So let's go ahead and actually the very first thing I'm going to do, because it's making me a little overwhelmed, is make this picture a little smaller. So let's find this logo. Actually, I don't even think there's a selector for it. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this logo. And let's just give it a width of, let's try 20%. So yay, already it's not like, ah, flowers. So that's the first thing I wanted to do. Now we're going to create our first flex box. So here's our nav. Let's make it a flex box. When I put display flex on this nav, what will we see happen? What's going to immediately change on screen when I add display flex here? The links will go to the right because this and this will all be on a row. So that's interesting. So we can, I'm going to throw a border on here. And then let's do nav links and throw a border on there. So we see we have these two flex items here. So a couple things we probably want to do is let's make these this nav bar a little bigger. I'm going to make this picture slightly larger, and then I'll make my nav, I'll give this a width of, let's do 70%. And then we want the image to have a little bit of space around it. So let's give it some margin. Maybe 5%, see how that looks. That's a little bit much. And then what do we want to do? So these skills are not where they need to, or skills, these links are not quite where they need to go. What can we do to put the links where we want? The positioning of the picture and the general positioning of the links is good, but what do we want to do to these links? We want them centered. So what we can do is justify content center and align items center. Except, uh-oh, that didn't work. Why did that not work? Yep, because these are actually grandchildren. So the flex from our nav is not going to trickle down. We have to do a display flex here. So we have this element here, this div is both a flex item and a flex container. And instead of centering, let's do space around. Maybe space evenly. So that generally looks like what we've got going on in our picture. Cool. So I'm going to kill these two borders. We don't need them anymore. And our nav is looking good. So let's go down to this thing. So if we look at our HTML code, we see that there is this title container div. Inside of it is main titles, and inside of that we have some headers. So what do you think we could do to get everything nicely centered here? Any thoughts? We want these guys, all three of these, kind of dead center in this purple section. I'm going to start throwing some borders on things just so we can see what we're doing. I'm going to just add a tiny margin too. This will help us see. Okay, so we can kind of see our way around a little bit. So this guy's already pretty flat or pretty centered. I think it's this orange one that we want to center. So if we want to center this orange guy, we can put flex on its parent. So this would be an example, kind of the first time seeing something pretty commonly used, which is a flex container that only contains one flex item. So this is pretty normal that we might actually create a flex container with just one item inside of it. And the main reason we do this is to center things. So we can do justify content center, align items center. And because the text is already aligned to the center, we're good to go on these. So let's go ahead and kill our borders. We don't need them anymore. And get rid of that margin too. All right. So now we have our About Me. The issue here is that we want, first of all, we want it to be a little smaller. So scrolling down here, we have an About section, and we have this div called Text. That's our kind of turquoise teal color. So let's give it a width, first of all. And by default, it's squished all the way to the side. So there's two different ways to do this. The first would be we could do exactly what we did up here. We could make this About section a flex container and center everything. And so we'd be using that same technique of just centering a single item using flex. But I want to show you the other way to do it. So the other way to do it would be, instead of giving this a width, we could just put some margin around it. So if we did margin for top, we want to leave it alone. And then for left and right, actually, I'm going to do it as padding. No, sorry, being indecisive. So we don't want any extra margin on the top or bottom, but we do want some on the left or right. So we can do 10% left or right, same effect. So that's two different ways of doing the same thing. We can either do it with margin, doing even margin on each side, or we can do it by giving it a width and making it a flex item. All right, the last thing we want is these skills. And I see that someone is muted. All right, so let's go ahead and do the skills. So looking down here, we see we have a section, we have a div called container, and then we have these skills. So there's a bit of a hint already here, but which item, which parent do we want to make our flex container in here so that we can actually get these skills in a column? The container, right? So these are the little divs. These divs down here are the ones that contain the skill text. So we want their immediate parent. So let's see if there is not yet a selector. So we can do skills container, display flex. And they're nicely formatted so they automatically look good here. Just one thing I want to point out is that we do have text align center in here. That's affecting the headers. So if we commented this out, our headers go somewhere weird. So we want to make sure that stays there. In the actual paragraphs, notice that we have some padding in here. This is that same technique where we're just doing left and right padding. So if I killed this, they'd all be running into each other. So that's really important too, to keep them separate. And then this was brought up near the beginning of class, which is that there's text align justify. So if we just had text align left, they'd look like that. Actually, I think that looks better personally, but justify is another option. I guess as we make our screen a little bigger, justify looks good. So that's a little walkthrough of how we can take all these skills and apply them to an actual development setting. Your homework for tonight is, I hope you liked Great Idea because you get to work with it more. So I just posted the link. It's the same project you just did, but you get to do it with Flex, which actually is way better, way easier. So you're going to revisit it and refactor. You can start from scratch, or you can pull your code over and refactor it. If your code was if your HTML was pretty tidy and things are mostly in place, I would refactor what you already worked on. So start with the old code and adjust it to use Flex. If it was a little messy, maybe you might want to start from scratch. And then additionally, you have to build a second page. So if you go into design files, notice that there is a second page here. So you will be revisiting what you did last time and then building this page additionally. Looks like there might be some Flex wrap going on here. So that is your assignment for tomorrow night. And yeah, Flex, it's a lot of fun. So let's answer any questions we have left. Can we have a link to the pen that we just went over? Sure. So I will save this. Yeah, this would be a great thing to use for reference on the homework. So I will paste it again. Any other questions? How does the sprint work for the 5th day? So yes, your 5th day, this time will be your sprint challenge. Your TLs will walk you through everything you need to do, but essentially it'll be like a project period, except the project will be cumulative. So you will receive your sprint challenge and you will have the allotted time to work on it. Other questions? All right. Well, you guys are almost through your very first sprint. One more project and then your sprint challenge this weekend. I hope you guys have been enjoying this so far. I know that the first week can be very challenging as we're getting used to everything, but I like to think of this night 4 as being a little bit of a reprieve after some challenging stuff. Flexbox can be tricky, but it's also a ton of fun to work with. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Have a great sprint challenge, and I will see you guys next Tuesday when we start the responsive design sprint. All right, have a great night.